Hi, I'm Roy Collin, the host of the podcast. You can find everything about me by scanning the QR code there or going to roycollin.com. And you'll find my six podcasts, the Podfather, helping people become podcasters, the Awakening, exposing fraud and corruption, but with solutions, the Crypto, all things blockchain technology, meditation podcast, speaking podcast, and the Learn Polish podcast. You can also help the show by actually making a donation, visiting the store, or helping my sponsors. I hope you enjoyed this week's show.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome. This is Grace Sagra of Quantum Nurse, and this is our collective podcast called Freedom International Livestream. And I am very proud to be joined today by our esteemed featured guest, Lawrence Freeman. And also, I am excited that my regular co host, my good friends from 2020, are continue to join me. And that is Roy Coughlan and Hartmut Schumacher. Roy is from Poland and, originally from Ireland, living in Poland and with the podcast, Awakening Podcast. And of course, Hartmut from Germany, still living in Germany. We encourage him, maybe he could think of moving. So, and of course, our new special guest host also is PD Lawton, whom you've heard before. He's speaking about Africa, and he is originally from South Africa but living in UK. And sooner or later, Drago Bosnick will be joining us. You know, he's a busy young man, but he continues to join us here. And Drago Bosnick lives in Serbia, and his expertise is more on the BRICS information, and so he's been all over in the alternative media. So today, in this podcast, as you know, the Freedom International live stream, we want to have an unfiltered conversation. And since the whole world has been shifting in terms of what's happening politically, economically, and we're happy with the shift. I'm happy with the shift. So I thought, let's finally, I was glad to have Lawrence Freeman, who just came back from China, and I've been following him through Matthew Arrett. So, and you all know that Matthew Arrett has been coming to us as our frequent guest. So thank you everyone for being here. And to all of you, if this podcast resonates to you, this episode, feel free. Please, please, please share it, like, thumbs up, and follow our guest and guest host. So Lawrence Freeman stands as a prominent political economic analyst with over 3 decades of dedicated experience in Africa, particularly within the discipline of physical economics. So his unwavering advocacy for authentic economic growth through the enhancement of critical infrastructure, particularly in rail transportation and electricity, underscores his commitment to the principle that economic development is a fundamental human right. So, by prioritizing the sovereignty of African nations, Freeman empowers local leaders to advocate for policies that center on the welfare of their citizens. And there's much more to be said about Lawrence Freeman, but I leave that to him as he continue and proceed leading us to this conversation. So thank you again. It was nice, really. I've been trying to wish and find you, and finally I got you. Okay. So let me bring Drago in. Welcome, Drago.
Hello, everyone. Pleasure to be here.
So I'd like to begin with that. Hold on one second. Okay. I guess I don't have any more echo. So I like to begin with the post that attracted me, and this was in the Sputnik Africa, Lawrence. And it says that um, the African nations are facing 500% increase in debt servicing cost when borrowing from global markets. That was according to the African Development Bank Vice President and Chief Economist Kevin Urama. And he was speaking at the Fifth African Union Extraordinary Session in Abuja, Nigeria. So he revealed that 49% of Africa's debt is privately owned in 2023, a figure expected to hit 54% by 2024, worsening financial strain, and that was reported. Then, and he said that to address these challenges, Urama proposed an African financial stability mechanism to provide sustainable refinancing solutions and reduce reliance on private creditors. He also called for global financial reforms, noting Africa as the only continent without a regional stability mechanism, making it vulnerable to external shocks. And I also been hearing from you that Africa has the Africa has the lowest of the poverty level among all continents. And that's really sad because growing up, I always thought that Africa, Philippines, Indonesia, we have so much raw resources, but how come we seem to just be kept down at the bottom of development? So, with this, I wanted to ask the question of what do you see as the most critical infrastructure projects Africa needs to prioritize for sustainable development, and what the challenges hinder their implementation. So this thing I think would be very helpful because again, when I was already in United States, and we have all this uh, pro, uh, project, and we hear a lot of people donating to Africa, all of this, but still Africa remains to have the lowest poverty level. So thank you for being with us, and please lead us to this conversation.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you. If you look at the poverty levels around the world, the main areas were China, Southeast Asia, and Africa. China has eliminated poverty virtually. About approximately 750 million people have been lifted out of poverty. And other corners of the world have also improved, including India, which had a high poverty rate. So Africa right now, the African nations have the majority, overwhelming majority of people still living on $2.15 a day or less. Approximately 450 million people out of a population of approximately 1.5 million people. And this is all in sub-Saharan Africa, that is the lower 2/3 of the nation below the Sahara Desert, where the poverty is. And unfortunately, the poverty numbers in absolute terms in Africa are growing. So there's no reduction in poverty, it's an increase. The percentage may decline because the population reproduces at a very high rate, but the number of people living in poverty continues to grow in Africa. And this is a crime, and there's no reason for it. There's absolutely none. There's no objective reason. And if anyone had any doubt, then you just have to look at the fact that China did it. It's not hypothetical. It's not conjecture. China eliminated poverty for 750 million people. So it can be done. What is missing is the intent. And Africa has deliberately been kept down. The various forces in the West will deny this, but it's been deliberately kept down, deliberately kept underdeveloped. And the results are what we see today in terms of poverty and hunger, both of which could be eliminated almost entirely within one generation, 20 years. Now, if you look at what is needed, there is no place in the world that economic development, when it takes place, it always rests on infrastructure. If you look at water, you look at electricity, you look at railroads, you look at roads, you put all these things together and you have an infrastructure platform, which is based on a certain level of scientific knowledge and technology at that historic moment. And that infrastructure is what a nation grows from and upon. And as more scientific advances occur, that technology is upgraded, and so the infrastructure actually becomes even more productive. But everywhere you study, the United States is an example, South Korea, of course, China, other Asian tigers, they channeled a portion of their money through various mechanisms. Some were budgetary, capital investment, some were setting up special banking operations, which we did in the United States, but they all channeled money into infrastructure because you cannot grow And you see this devastating deficit in Africa in infrastructure. Electricity doesn't exist really for most of the continent, for most of sub-Saharan Africa. It exists in the northern Maghreb countries, nations. But you have, less than, 70, 80,000 megawatts for over 1 billion people. You have places in sub-Saharan Africa where people may have 50 watts available to them. Compare that to the U.S., where we have a minimum of 1,500 watts available to each person 24/7. So my rough back-of-the-envelope calculation is Africa needs about 1,500 gigawatts of power. Not mega, but gigawatts of power. Now, most people will say that's impossible, it can't be done. It has to be done. And we did it in the United States. They did it in China. We had on the Roosevelt, almost 100 years ago, we had the rural electrification program, which brought electricity to rural America. There's no reason it can't be done, but you have to make long-term, low-interest loans, investments in the areas of electricity and other areas of infrastructure, such as rail, to make this happen. Because infrastructure usually takes several years. It has a very expensive price tag, usually billions of dollars per project. But the profitability is in the increase of the quality and output of productive economy of that nation. So you may not make a lot of money on a railroad per se, but your economy will make a lot of money by investing in the railroad. As China has once again proved, we proved the United States, but that was a long time ago. China just proved in the last generation when they invested massively in infrastructure, especially rail and electricity. So this has to be done. How are you going to do it? Well, there's two ways you could do it. So you could give outright grants, the West and the developed nations. You could give the money in terms of long-term loan, but you would have no interest rate payback. You would just allow the loan to be invested in this infrastructure, which would be profitable to any thoughtful capitalist who is an industrial capitalist, not a financier capitalist. Because the lifting up of the population of Africa, which is heading towards 2.5 billion in the next generation or so, would increase the demand for all goods around the world in all trade. Or the more acceptable method for my radical proposal would be you create a bank. I was working with a group of Africans for an African infrastructure bank where you would capitalize the bank, and the bank would have lending policies for infrastructure projects across Africa. You maybe have to capitalize the bank at several $100 billion or $1 trillion, and then you lend out portions of it to be also paid by the country receiving the loan for infrastructure projects only. We're not paying the debt. We'll put the debt in moratorium for the moment and deal with it later. We're going to create essentially new debt, which is what a loan is, but this will be dedicated only for infrastructure and no other purpose. And this has to be done on a massive level. I mean, Africa has a deficit of trillions of dollars of infrastructure. Some people say we need to invest $250 billion a year in infrastructure. I would say that's conservative. And the main country has done this is China. There are some other nations in the world who make investments. The Turkish government has built some railroads. Other governments are. The U.S. now has proposed its first infrastructure development project since John F. Kennedy supported Kwame Nkrumah's Volta Dam project in the 1960s. It's called the Libido Corridor, which Biden made his first and only visit to Africa this past days. This project could be productive. How it's going to be funded, I have no idea. I'm very unclear how the U.S. plans on funding this. How it's going to be built, it's unclear. It's certainly going to be several years. But the United States is very open in all the discussions, including this idiot Biden we have for president, in saying that they admit this is to counter China. So it's not, the motivation is not to develop Africa. It is to get the precious minerals from the DRC and Zambia, but it's to counter China. And Biden lied in Angola, Luanda, the capital of Angola, yesterday or the day before, like he lies in the United States. He said that unlike other countries, China, who don't provide infrastructure, who don't really help the people, who don't provide electricity, we are going to do that, which is just typical Biden being a fraud on that matter. But the fact of the matter is, we need many libido corridor projects. We need nuclear power in every nation in Africa if we're going to get the gigawatts necessary. We have one nuclear power plant on the whole continent in P.D. Lawden's home country, South Africa. We have no energy anywhere. We don't have rail transportation. Over the last 20 years, China is building rail and it's paying off. We'll probably need a minimum of 50, I would say 100,000 kilometers of rail to connect the major seaports, capitals, and population centers in Africa. And don't forget, Africa is projected to be 2.4, 2.5 billion people by 2050. So that's about 25 years from now. And if we don't do this, there's going to be a disaster, famine, massive terrorism, destabilizations everywhere. If we have enough brains to do this now, we will build up the biggest economy the world has ever seen. And Africa will be the center of trade and commerce, which is what all thoughtful statesmen and leaders should be thinking about today. But instead, we don't have any plans in the West except this one proposal to actually do what is necessary. And it's an ideological blind spot. From the rules-based order, they see Africa as an area of the world of which to dominate their hegemony over China, but they don't see it as an area of the world that development should be the primary motivation.
With the ports, because I see China has renovated like 100 ports, and there's something like 46 or 48 that are existing construction or future. Are they actually taking control of these ports, or are they just kind of lending to do it? Because the fair is that they have full control then of the ports.
Usually they have a company, it's run by that nation with the nation's agreement. They may perform some management relations, but the country where the port is built, they own the port. This idea that China is deliberately putting countries into debt on opaque agreements to seize the asset or seize the reserves of the country, this is absolutely false. It never has happened. It hasn't happened anywhere in Africa. So they have arrangements with these countries, but the country is in charge. They may hire Chinese management. And of course, right now, it's virtually no Chinese labor involved. It's all African labor. So these ports and these railroads in Kenya, Tanzania, Nigeria, these railroads are owned by that country for the benefit of that country, and the loan that China gives is paid back on the agreements that are made between the two nations. But as our host was mentioning at the very beginning, the majority of the debt in the world is owned by private investors and banking consortiums. China, according to one estimate I heard, one country has 11% of African debt. One other issue, some people say 12, some people say 15, but it's a total minority of debt that is owed to China. So this whole idea that Africa is indebted to China is another lie of the rules-based order. Now, this debt is massive. And as I said, we're going to have to put it in moratorium to create new, better debt that will be directed directly into only infrastructure projects.
I would like, no, just sorry there, Hartman, then you can, with the free trade, I just assumed it was free trade in Africa, and I see that I think FTA was in January 21. So was it that previous to that there wasn't free trade in Africa?
No, and one of the things that the African Free Trade Continental Act is trying to correct is to eliminate the barriers between African nations, tariffs in particular, transportation agreements, etc., because they will have internally a market as a continent larger than either India or China as a continent. And therefore, that market has been restricted in various ways. Don't forget, this whole thing comes from the legacy of colonialism. And people say, oh, you can't discuss that. That was 60 years ago, 100 years ago. It still has its effects in Africa that really has started in the 1420s and 30s and 40s when the Europeans started taking slaves out of Lagos and later Angola and other parts of the continent. And that then became morphed into the Berlin Conference with spheres of influence where Africa was divided up to a handful of European nations. And then when these nations became free, they all became subject to the IMF, World Bank, colonial lending policy. So they really haven't experienced a great deal of freedom anywhere on the continent, especially economic freedom. And all these relationships, such as tariffs and border restrictions, this is all the legacy of colonialism. In fact, my first trip to Africa in 1994 to Lagos, and now since then maybe a couple dozen trips, but the first, I would say throughout the 90s, we were always taking a plane to Europe and then from Europe to the African country. And this was true for Africans. You would go to Europe to get to the rest of the world. Now that's changed with Ethiopian Airlines' massive deployment of transportation throughout Africa, and there's a couple of other airlines. So just think about that they couldn't even, to get from one African country to another, you had to go to Europe. So the fact that the free trade agreement is good if it's predicated with a dedicated commitment on building the infrastructure, which in many cases will be transboundary. It'll go from one country into another, especially water arrangements. Now, I don't know. I've discussed with people from the day it was created, and they tell me this is their desire, but they really have to get serious. In my view, and I'll put this as bluntly and as clearly as I can to any policy, for me, a policy is only good if it actually raises the material standard of living of its citizen. That is, that they live better as a result of that policy. And if that policy does not raise the standard of living of Africans, then I'm not really that interested in it, and I don't think it serves much good. That's my fundamental criteria, improving the standard of living of people by improving the capabilities of the productive economy.
And just finally, before I know Hartman wants to jump in there, with the BRICS, I think it's Ethiopia, Egypt, there's a few of them. Is there a list of ones that are trying to get in, or have any decided that they don't want to be involved in the BRICS?
Well, in the last BRICS meeting, which took place in Kazan in Russia, just recently, they have now 13 BRICS partners on top of the 9 that are part of the BRICS. Don't forget, several were added this January. United Arab Emirates, Iran, Ethiopia, and Egypt, and that brought it up to 9. And then now there's 13 partners. Now 3 of those partners are African nations: Uganda, a relatively small country; Algeria, the largest country on the continent; and Nigeria, the largest population country on the continent. So now, potentially, the BRICS has 6 nations in Africa, of which dominate the majority of the population, the majority of gas and oil reserves, and other physical commodities are already in these 6 countries. So the BRICS in Africa is fundamental importance, and it's going to continue to grow. One article I read said there's about 20 to 30 other countries that are trying to join the BRICS. And I just read an article yesterday that Nigeria has not secret, but they have diplomatic relations with South Africa to help them join the BRICS, to actually become an official member. They're appealing to their brothers in South Africa to facilitate the process. So the BRICS and Africa are very much tied together for the future of the continent and implicitly the future of the world.
Oh, excellent. That's Joe for the Heartwood. Thanks, Lawrence.
Thank you so much. Lawrence, it's really cool to have you here on the show because I was deep involved in Africa for a couple of years with projects. I don't want to tell because I want to criticize the go. For this reason, I don't want to be so precise.
Okay.
And the point is I work with ex-military specialists who were in Africa, and their partners, when they were active in Africa, they are now in positions in ministries. So there are many projects which shall be done in Africa, and we try to finance these projects because we had all the infrastructure, we had the technicians, we had the companies who could build all these things, we had the companies who would like to finance the things. But the point is that these countries are very depending on the Western world by the old credit or by their own debts, because they are in general in dollars. They have a lot of debts in dollars. And if they try to free themselves, in that moment, there are countries which want to freeze these credits. And the problem is, if you want to work in international business, and the banks who work in international business need a sovereign guarantee. And the problem with the sovereign guarantee is that it has a signature and a stamp from the World Bank or IMF or from both. And so that someone who is constructing something in the country has the possibility to confiscate the infrastructure immediately. The problem what the most African countries have is that when they ask the Western world to support them, that they don't get any sovereign guarantees anymore, and they can only give parliamentarian guarantees. But with a parliamentarian guarantee, no one has the possibility to confiscate anything. And so it is not a value for establishing a new infrastructure project. And I was involved from 2018 to 2019 for nearly 1.5 to 2 years in the financing project of a petrochemical facility. We wanted to give the country the opportunity to produce its own oil product. We were very close also to the president. But the problem was then after 1.5 years of very tough negotiations, that we found out that the people around him are well paid by the people, paid for getting the oil product out of the country and getting the oil products, the end products, in the country. So that no one was really interested in establishing a petrochemical facility with which they could pay back their debts. And if you see Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, these are countries which have also uranium as a resource. And in the moment when they kicked out the French people, the French military, the price of uranium increased from $20 per kg to $200 per kg. And this is the reason why the Western world doesn't want to have any establishing of infrastructure in Africa.
In the moment they will bring infrastructure in Africa, the commodity prices will rise because then they can organize everything. And the BRICS state, in my opinion, is the best solution for Africa, because by the BRICS state, they set their own financial system. And so the African countries have the possibility to get a fair credit by the BRICS in order to establish the infrastructure. But I doubt that this will come from the European or from the Western side. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, don't forget the G7, which is supposed to be the advanced sector nations, is a minority. The global South is a majority. And the BRICS, I would say, is the point of the spear for the global South. And of course, China, I think, is the key to that. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to get what's called now a new financial architecture.
Correct.
If you go back, and I don't know how old you are and how much you follow politics, but in the 1970s, you had people like Indira Gandhi from India, Lopez Portillo, the president of Mexico, and others. And they were calling for a new world just economic order. That was variations of that name. And that's what we now call the global South. Then we probably called it the non-aligned. That's what they were thinking about a half a century ago. And it's now become very relevant that we need to have a system that benefits the majority of the world population. Whether hedge fund guys get their money on time or get all their money on time is not the most important thing to me. It's human life that's the most important thing. So we have to have a system that promotes human life. And the system that promotes human life requires a financial system that promotes development. And the BRICS are very open about this. They're not a military alliance. They're not like NATO. They're an economic alliance. And they say in a development bank, somewhere in the preamble, that they exist to promote growth or the development of these nations. And that's what has to happen. That's what has to take hold. The good news is that the West, which I accept the name of the new root-based order, which is based on this idea of who's on top and who's on the bottom, zero-sum game mentality. They're in trouble. Of course, as you know, your own country is in big trouble economically and probably top on the stupidity list for shutting down the nuclear power plants. France has now collapsed again yesterday. The United States is totally indebted. If you add up all the debt of the United States, consumer debt, credit card debt, mortgage debt, federal debt, state debt, corporate debt, it's $100 trillion of debt in the United States. And you have a financial system that has quadrillions of dollars in derivative funny money investments. So the Western system is in terrible shape. The United States government is, the previous administration was a disaster. And even though the American people voted for a throw the bums out total change in Washington, it's not clear to me that the people coming in know how to do that in terms of policy. They have a lot of changes they want to make, but do they understand the role of the American system policy or the China's policy of development? And will they apply it for development here and throughout the world? I don't see it by the current individuals, including the person nominated for Secretary of the Treasury. But in any case, the West is not in good shape. And therefore, now is the time for the BRICS and the global South to, as we say in the United States, pull their weight because they're the majority and start initiating policies that will change the world by improving the standard of living of the majority of people. Right now, Africa is the African Union has become part of the G20, which is a much larger group than the G7. And South Africa is the head of it for a year. Now, will the South Africans make the fundamental demand, infrastructure development to advance the standard of living of people? That would be very key to me. I know they're thinking about it, but they have to really fight for it. We have to see this like a military objective. Take World War II, take the best of the crowd that wanted to achieve a military victory. You have to have that sense of commitment. This is a battle. If we don't get the electricity and infrastructure into Africa, we will not survive. So therefore, we have to do it. And you have to have that commitment. And, all other issues can be dealt with, secondary, tertiary, we'll work them out. But we are going to do this, or people are going to continue to die in poverty, from poverty and hunger. And that's the commitment that we have to have from leaders of the global South. I think they agree with me. I'm not sure they're as ruthless as I
am. What I want to mention is we had here in the show Stas Bogdanov from St. Petersburg, a friend of mine, and he showed a picture from 1955 or 52. And in this picture, you saw two girls who were 5 years old and an African boy of 3 years old who was sitting in a cage. Yeah, like a bird cage. And he explained to us that the difference between the Western colonialism and the Russian connection to Africa is that the Russian appreciated every time the African culture. And the Western world, they saw them like animals. And the colonialists and the son or the daughters of the colonialists who were 4 years old in 1950, they are now the people who are in charge today. And for this reason, this idea to increase the infrastructure in Africa from a Western point of view means that the commodities will rise rapidly and they cannot pay it. Because sarcastic voices that the dollar first was the dollar gold backed, then it was oil backed, now it's military backed. Yeah, and for this reason, chaos is a guarantee for having low commodity prices. This is the way the Western thinks. And this is the reason why I think the BRICS states are characterized by one thing. The most BRICS states have commodities. Brazilian, Russia, India, yeah, they all have it. South Africa, what was C? BRICS? What was the C? I forgot it.
China.
Oh, sorry. Yes, they all have commodities, and the most countries which are joining BRICS are countries with commodities. So the BRICS is a huge danger for the Western world. When it's only military backed.
Correct. That's why the new rules-based order crowd, they can't really accept the reality of the BRICS, and in particular the reality of what China has done in 2 generations. So as some of my articles I put in, they're in denial or dementia, because this is going to move forward. It's not going to be reversed. Now, there may be more wars. The neocons, both Democrat and Republican, are capable of starting more wars and starting much larger war than we presently have. But you're not going to reverse the BRICS or the global South unless we get a bunch of leaders in these countries who are easily manipulated and co-opted. And that is a serious problem. And I'm seeing signs of that already, which concern me. But nevertheless, the dynamic for the BRICS and for the global South is to change these economic policies and the economic system. We have to have a system of credits and economy and finances that promote the physical economy, the welfare of the people. The system can be changed, can be thrown away, and a new system can come in, but the system has to be a slave to the intent of improving the physical economy and standard of living of people. So if the system doesn't serve that purpose, then it's a useless system. Now, most people don't know this, although the evidence is there, that Franklin Roosevelt, when he promoted the Bretton Woods system, mainly through his Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Harry Dexter White, and this is documented in a recent book, they wanted to create a system that would provide capital for the undeveloped sector, for infrastructure. They say that explicitly in all their documents. And I believe that's the direction that the Bretton Woods would have gone if Roosevelt had died on April 12, 1945, and this mental pygmy Truman took over and destroyed everything that Roosevelt tried to do, including preventing the use of nuclear weapons. So there has been times in the history of the United States and other countries where the intent has been correct and it's been sabotaged. Now, the intent of the BRICS, especially its leadership, is clear. Now, whether they stick to it and expand it and fulfill the mission that they set for themselves, that's going to require real leadership, real courage. I think what they call in French, vertu, is going to be the mentality that these leaders are going to have to develop.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Pastor Tupici. Thank you so much. It was brilliant.
Thanks. Yeah. Just getting back, Larry, your thoughts on security, please. So, going back to what Helmut was saying, that the question of the commodity prices going up, so therefore it's to the benefit of the North, the global North, whatever, to have Africa as a raw materials market for the rest of the world, which one can easily see this is what the rules-based order has done, has imposed Malthusian policies on the entire continent to keep it a raw materials market, which it still is. Very, very few cases of mineral beneficiation. I believe Mali very recently are going to start refining their own gold, which is very exciting. There's mineral beneficiation going on in Ghana, South Africa, but they're very, very, very few cases. And it's been a policy, a deliberate policy. So along with that issue of you don't build the infrastructure, there's also the issue of you can't build the infrastructure because of security. And you've got that many wars. It's not a case that Africa has become a more peaceful continent. It has actually become a more dangerous continent. In the last 50 years, there've been more wars than ever. And we're looking now at the regions like the Sahel, the Maghreb. You've got Mozambique, very interesting case directly linked to natural gas, the discovery of natural gas. You've got Eastern Congo, directly linked to coltan, cobalt, and other critical minerals that are needed for green energy, for the lithium batteries, for computers, whatever. So you have this contradictory thing where you cannot build that high-speed railway, or you cannot put in that wonderful new motorway connecting regions because of the instability. And I know a classic point, a classic example is in Eastern Congo. They desperately need infrastructure. It has the world's I think you can correct me on this one, Larry. The world's worst infrastructure deficit is in Congo, second largest country in the entire continent. It's vast. So they want to build a road from Bukavu in one province to Goma in the next province. Now they can't do it because of the insecurity. The construction companies don't want to come in because there's that number of militant groups there. So you have a case where it's not possible. It's how are you going to implement it when you have instability? And of course, as we well know, that instability is also part of a deliberate policy. I believe it was Alfred Mackinder, and his idea of destabilizing the region to keep the heartland secure. So these wars and low intensity wars are once again benefiting those who benefit from having Africa underdeveloped and unindustrialized. So could you, Lawrence, address that issue of how would a policymaker look at insecurity on the continent, and where do you start? What would your thoughts be on that?
Well, the first thing we'd have to agree upon is that the instability at its root cause is the intentional underdevelopment of the African nations and the intention of colonialism. You look at, for example, take the case of Kenya. In the late 1800s, 19th century, you had Kikuyu were the major farmers in some of the richest land in Kenya. And then the British come in, they take over with the lords and ladies and debauchery and whatever else they did in their hotels. And they kicked the Kikuyu out of what was called the highlands, the most productive area of agriculture. And they took them over. And they rewrote the map. I have a copy of it called the White Lands after they kicked out the Kikuyu from the highlands. And this then set the Kikuyu off to go into other lands. And you had a destabilization between the various tribes, the Kalenjin, the other tribe, ethnic groups, I would call them, in the area, now fighting over diminishing land and over diminishing quality land. This is typical of how countries were set up to be destabilized. I saw the same thing very clearly because I was so involved in it for several years in Ethiopia. But now, if you look at recent elections in countries where there is ethnic divisions, Nigeria, Kenya, Ethiopia, etc., you find that people will vote for the person of their ethnicity because that is the way they believe they will get the most benefit in returns of services to their people. They're not thinking about the country. They're thinking about how do we survive, our group. And our group will survive if a member of our group is in the presidency or the vice presidency, some leading position. So what you have from the history of the legacy of colonialism is you have no functioning African nation that operates on the basis of sovereignty of a nation state. And it doesn't exist anywhere. Parts of it exist, but no nation has the idea and the people in it, the idea that they are responsible to the future of their nation, not their ethnic group. And this, of course, was part of the Biafra War, which tore apart Nigeria from 1967 to 1970. It was part of the wars that have been going on in Ethiopia since 2018. So we have to realize that if people are desperate and they don't have food and they don't have a way of life and they don't have a way to take care of their children and feed them and protect them, then they are easily manipulated. And they will fight against their against their brothers and sisters for the right to have their water hole as opposed to someone else having that water hole, so to speak, as a metaphor. So you have the lack of economic growth is the root cause, I would say, of almost all instabilities and wars and conflicts on the continent. The deliberate underdevelopment. You deny the people the right to live, and they will kill their brothers and sisters so they can live and their children can live. So that's the fundamental that's the nut that has to be broken. And we have to set up, for example, in these areas where people think they're making money on commodity prices, we have to penalize them for that. We have to shut down this market, which most people focus on the gangs and the groups that are in the nations, such as you're well aware of in Southeast Democratic Republic of the Congo and other places, and set up internationally. We're not going to accept these materials at these prices unless we actually promote the development and manufacturing capability in these areas. We have to punish this outlaw because it wouldn't happen without the financial sector of the rules-based order operating it. I mean, this is the history of Nigeria, which took me several years to learn. But there has been total manipulation and thievery of oil in Nigeria, but it was set up by the seven sister oil companies when the Royal Dutch Shell set up its first oil well in 1956. They ran the country, a shadow government, and they created a cabal that would deprive the Nigerian people of refined oil to this day, except recently now there's a new oil refinery built by Nagonte, a billionaire. So the problem is that this is on the other side of the corrupt predator financial system, works to create these conditions. And we have to set up a new system that punishes and penalizes people who are disrupting the natural process of development. Now, on the African side, you have had this year more than ever before a real drive to insist that African nations to add value, what you call the beneficiation, to their products. I mean, I saw this up front when I was in the Cote d'Ivoire several years ago. They don't control anything about cocoa, but they carry out slave labor to produce it. Yeah. So I remember Natalie Pandor, who's now the former prime minister. She's resigned her post earlier this year. But when she went to the DRC earlier this year, she made a speech where she says, we should not allow any products any raw materials or natural resources be taken from our country without us adding value to them. Well, that's the way we've got to enforce it. Now, the Biden crowd in Europe says this libido corridor is not, quote, to extract precious, I guess now they call them critical minerals, and it really will build up manufacturing. Well, that would be a real change in policy if that were to occur. But nevertheless, the Africans have to insist on this. Now, the West can punish the African nation, as has been mentioned earlier. And they're going to have to find a way to survive those financial penalties by grouping together, as they're doing in the BRICS and they're doing in the Global South. We're going to help each other, and we're going to protect each other to survive the counterattack from the Western financial predators. And they're going to have to work out the allies and mechanisms of support, because there is a disintegration going on in the so-called advanced sector. It's not so advanced anymore, as we're beginning to realize. And therefore, it's a war. Now, it's not a war of people should go around killing everybody. It's a war of politics and statesmanship and learning how to outflank your enemy so that we can actually break through with a new system that represents the interest of the majority of the people. And that's what the new rule-based order is really hysterical about. When I was at this conference in Beijing, the only Western leader that had speak there was the defense minister for Germany, everybody there was mainly military. It was a defense security conference that I spoke at in Beijing, the Beijing Hangshan Forum. And the defense minister from Germany said, he said, well, we're now in a multipolar world. So we have to figure out how to provide a framework of order, i.e. rules-based order, to that multipolar world. And that's what they're going to try to do. They're going to try to pick off countries and manipulate them and co-opt them through the IMF and other institutions. And they're going to try to find a way of imposing their rules, but now in a different context because of the fact that the Global South and the BRICS genie is out of the bottle. So the answer to your question starts with the intent. Do we have nations that, with the intent of actually making sure that we have this economic development, which begins with infrastructure? And we have to win over enough of the world to commit themselves that this is the policy and that we're going to act aggressively against those people who have a counter policy. I mean, when I've been dealing with this now for over 35 years, so it's almost half my lifetime, and people will say, well, but you can't really have your economic development policy unless you have security. And I would say no. I would say you're not going to have peace and security unless you have economic development. And I think when the Pope Paul VI in 1967, in his famous encyclical, Populorum Progressio, said this. He said the new name for peace is development. And that's the only way you're going to secure peace, is when people have a rising standard of living and see a secure future for their offspring.
Thank you.
Hello, Lawrence. It's a pleasure to have you here, of course. My question is a bit longer because I usually deal with military technology and stuff like that. So it's going to be connected to the security situation in Africa. Mainly, I just want to start by saying that the EU essentially has an interest in making sure that Africa is not a developed continent. I remember, I think it was Macron, maybe 2017, 2018, I forgot the exact year. He said that Europe is going to have 50 to 150 million applicants moving into the continent in the next 30 years. So, of course, the reason for this is certainly not to make sure that these people are, have a good life. It's all about making sure that Europe has cheap labor. So in order to move such a massive number of people from Africa, they certainly would have to ensure that the African countries are destabilized because, I mean, the very concept of mass migration is not natural. I mean, it comes, if it happens, let's say, incrementally, that is a logical thing that has always been happening in human history. But if you have 150 million people moving at such a short period of time, it has to be some sort of a disaster or something. So I presume that the financial institutions which run many of the governments in Africa would want to make sure that the countries are so destabilized that these people will have no other choice but to go to Europe because their lives will be destroyed to the point of them, choosing to be essentially slave labor in Europe over living in their own countries. And of course, we see pushback and we see the AES or former Mali Empire, as our friend Kevin likes to say. For those who don't know, I mean specifically Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, who have formed this military alliance essentially, and this has deterred France from intervening in these countries. So do you think that forming a sort of like this military coalition of African states, do you think that it could speed up the process of essentially creating sovereignty in Africa that's going to ensure that they have the basis to create a system that's going to make everyone live better, not end up being slaves in Europe or anywhere else?
Well, the question is, are these African nations sovereign? Do they determine their own existence? Now, you can't have sovereignty if your economy and your finances are controlled outside of your country. And that's one of the reasons you're seeing this rebellion in the Sahel. It's a rebellion against the French 14 Francophone nations, where they had to deposit half their reserves in the banks in Paris. So this is a long-known question, and even the countries that have not rebelled, there are several other nations, Senegal, for example, Gabon, they're also all considering the question of leaving the French Francophone alliance for all valid reasons. So sovereignty requires the ability for you to develop your own economy for the future and benefit of your population living today, and those people who will be born in the future. You also have to have a military capability to defend your sovereignty. But you're not going to defeat the West on military grounds. That's really never going to happen. And by focusing on security, especially kinetic warfare, you often miss the cause of the problem. I mean, the United States and Europe are probably, I'm guessing over the last 10, 15 years, maybe have sunk $1 trillion into supporting kinetic warfare in the Sahel, which of course they helped destabilize by the overthrow and assassination of Gaddafi under the great liberals, Obama, Biden, Clinton, Samantha Powers, etc. But they put in, if it's not $1 trillion, it's way up there, hundreds of billions, into kinetic warfare. And it's been a total failure. I think the Russians are going to have a problem too, even with their new Africa Corps renamed, because you can't stop rebellions where you have desperate people. I mean, if you don't feed people, if you don't provide them with clean water, if you don't provide them with jobs, you don't provide a future for their children, then they're going to act, and maybe act in a way that is not the most thoughtful, or they're going to be manipulated to act, which comes from their desperation. So the question is setting up a new financial architecture. Obviously, you'd have a new security architecture as well that would provide for the rights and the sovereignty of all nations in the world. And that would have avoided this conflict between Ukraine and Russia if there'd been a new security arrangement that respected their security concerns. So you have to have this as one concept, which is all going to be outside of the current thinking of the rules-based order. Don't forget, all the politicians, I haven't studied Europe politicians as closely, but they're not that different than American politicians. They have no independent thinking. Their whole mindset is shaped by the groupthink of the rules-based order. We have to be number one because it's zero sum. It's fixed. It doesn't grow. It doesn't develop. It doesn't change. The world is fixed. So you're either on top or you're on the bottom. We're going to be on top. And all of the people on both sides, the Republicans, the Democrats, the so-called Trump people, the so-called liberal Biden people, Biden-Harris people, how is it they all agree that China is the number one enemy that has to be counted and kept down and weakened and eventually destroyed, or if not destroyed, severely weakened? They all agree on that. How'd that happen? All different shades of all different political ideology, because they all do accept this zero-sum game in some aspect. And so does the population. The population knows nothing about China, zero, maybe -0 if that's possible. But nevertheless, you talk to my friends, some who are quite intelligent will fall right into China's our number one enemy. Well, how did that happen? So the problem is we have a real destructive mentality that is totally pervasive throughout the Western world. And that's not going to easily be overturned. We're going to need some true leaders and true statesmen to speak the truth, while the BRICS and the Global South do not miss a beat. They're not looking for a confrontation. As I said, they're not a military alliance. There's no commitment of military. They have to pursue aggressively their political, economic understanding of what's necessary for their countries without intentionally antagonizing the West, but they will antagonize the West. And the West is going to have to rethink and regroup if it wants to become a dominant player in the world again. But that requires serious self-reflection and self-analysis, which is very hard for anyone to do, much less so-called leaders to do. But the reality, hopefully, will force them into some kind of rethinking. Now, I mean, for example, if you take the case of the Democrat Party, they got beat pretty decisively. I mean, actually, the Dems won one more seat in the House than they had before, but Trump and the Senate went to the Republicans. They have to rethink what their problem was, which is obvious to most analysts, which is they were unconcerned about the real issues facing the American people, and the American people wanted change. Now, whether they will actually do that is questionable, because what I've read so far from the various leaders of the party is they don't understand it, and they're not changing at all. And that's going to make them possibly lose more support. And the same thing is going to be faced on an international level. Is the rule-based order West going to adjust to this new dynamic that's coming from the BRICS and the global South, which will require a new financial architecture, a new security architecture? And it's all based on one principle, which P.D. Lawton has heard me speak about before, which is it's all based on one principle for me. Everything I do is based on one principle. It's an extension of one principle, which is that all human beings are created with the potential of creative thought. And there's no other creature, and there's no machine. And AI can't do it, animals can't do it. Only the human mind is capable of creative thought, of discovering a principle that is yet to be discovered for humankind. And so it's the nurturing of that quality of the mind that is the most important fundamental thing a country, a nation, a government can do, which requires the material standard of living. So the material standard of living is subordinated to the mental, cultural development of the human mind. So if people don't have electricity and they don't have housing, they don't have food, they're being deprived of using their mind because they don't have time to even think. But we need an educated citizenry in every country that has a secure standard of living that enables them to spend more and more hours per day, not in manual labor, but in creative thought and studying policy and studying what is necessary for their country and for other countries in the world, and studying science and culture. This is what is necessary for the human race to move forward. So therefore, every country has actually the exact same interest. The problem is we have leaders who are killers or stupid. Like take the case of Netanyahu, who's been a bum since his group participated in the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin in 1985, which was part of the group that Netanyahu was leading in the Likud party. So he's always been a bum, and he's always been a killer. But now he's actually destroying his own country by his actions. So he doesn't understand anything about the history of Judaism and the history of Jewish philosophers and Jewish scientists and Jewish musicians that make contributions from the Jewish people. He doesn't understand anything about this, going back thousands or at least hundreds of years, going back to Philo of Alexander, who is a contemporary of Jesus Christ in his philosophy, and he lived at the same time. So you have people who are so degenerate and destroyed in their own mind, they can't even think about what the qualities of human beings are that make us fundamentally have the same self-interest. The same self-interest. Different culture, different language, the same self-interest. The development of the human being and the development of the human mind on top, the head on top of the body, which has to be supplied through physical material necessities. That's the key to all policy. Security policy, economic policy, foreign policy, it all rests on understanding that one principle. And if you don't understand it, you're not going to be able to make the changes in the world necessary.
Couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. And thank you, as Fartrup said, it's fascinating what you said.
Oh, thank you. So, Lawrence, as an educator, okay, so who teaches African history and advocates for transformative change, what role then does the education play in empowering not just African youth, because you teach here, and we're connected, the American youth, and I hope other teachers like you or academician like you will be listening to this, to what you have to say, and to lead the continent, and to lead also where we share our money, where we share our support, or maybe prevent the young people from joining the jihadist terrorism that PD Lawton noted, and the Boko Haram. And I think PD can share more about that. But anyway, so what role does the education? Because education is crucial. All this I know we're emphasizing the economy, but it's the mind that's crucial. So please.
Well, for example, if you take the situation in the United States, I love the principles of which my country was founded on. The problem is we haven't lived up to them. And this was outlined very early on. There's a book called The Federalist Papers, which are about 80 or so papers, essays written by Hamilton J. Madison to convince the New York people to vote for the Constitution. They needed 9 out of 13 colonies to adopt the Constitution. But in these papers, they discuss all the difficulties and challenges facing a republic. And Franklin summed it up during one of the conventions they were having, the constitutional conventions. And as the story goes, a woman walked up to him and said, "What kind of a government are you giving us, Mr. Franklin?" And he said, she said, "A republic or an empire?" And he said, "A republic, if you can hold on to it." And how do you hold on to a republic? How do you hold on to any notion of a principle? Is you have to have an educated citizenry. And the founding fathers assumed that there would be an educated citizenry in the United States. In fact, that's the reasons they set up the Electoral College, is we're the only country where the popular vote does not determine the election. It's supposed to be representatives from each state who are originally were supposed to be the wisest and most thoughtful people, as our representatives in Congress supposed to be the wisest and most thoughtful people. So there wasn't, quote, the democracy in sheer numbers. The mob didn't rule. And that's a brilliant, and there's no country in the world that has an electoral college that I know of. But the problem is the citizens in our country have been dumbed down. And I had the unfortunate, in terms of painful, but yet invaluable experience of being a substitute teacher for 4 years in Maryland. And my wife is a teacher for special education. And we discuss these questions all the time, but we're not teaching the basics to children in the United States. And there's a report that came out earlier this year that only 1/3 of third graders know the basics and how to read. Now, the theory is from kindergarten to third grade, you learn how to read. And from third grade on, you read to learn. And these kids can't read. So what does that say about the leaders of the United States in the next 15 to 20 years, or 30 years, when these children will be in their 20s and 30s? What does it say when you listen to the presentations by senators and congressmen who have no thought content to their presentations? And you compare that to the Lincoln-Douglas debates, where each person spoke for an hour and a half, standing up to a crowd listening, standing up. And then they rebutted. So maybe it went on for 4 hours. Who has the attention span to listen to that, much less who could give a presentation standing up for an hour and a half filled with ideas? It was all about slavery with Douglas. So now you switch over to Africa, where the projections are there's going to be about 1 billion youth, and they define youth differently than we do in the West. It's 35, I think, to 15 or something. So it's going to be 1 billion young people whose minds can be developed, and each one of them can be a source of creativity. So that is there's some people talking about the demographic bulge of the youth is a disaster for Africa. I don't see it as a disaster. I don't see overpopulation. I'm opposed to any concept of reducing the population. I don't see we can ever have too many people, because people are the source of all wealth and beauty, and therefore there can never be too many of them. The question is, we may not develop our economies properly to support them, but that's a subjective problem. So you're going to have 1 billion young people in Africa. Are you going to develop the society and education and culture so that their minds make contributions not just to Africa, but to the total globe, of which they will dominate? The projections are 1/4 of the people in the world will be African in 2015. Some of you guys may be around. I'm not sure I'll make it that far. But the fact of the matter is, what's going to be the basis of those African youth? Many places in Africa, schools aren't even taking place regularly. Now, you go back to a previous generation, people in their 60s and 70s now, a lot of people I know on that level in Africa, they were highly educated at the time. But that education, I mean, they were memorizing Shakespeare plays like we did in the West. One of my Nigerian friends came to my Thanksgiving dinner and gave Julius Caesar's presentation. So this is something that is a very serious problem. The reason I focus on the economic is because without the economic development, people can't live and survive and think. Think about leisure time. Look at the leisure time we have here that we could have this discussion. But they don't have that leisure time in Africa because they're out there hustling and manipulating, contriving, and trying to eke out an existence for them and feed their babies for tomorrow. So leisure time is an essential part of a republic. It's an essential part of human life, of this planet. And yet there's a whole sections of the world that don't have leisure time. They don't think about libraries. Okay, everything's going digital. I'm an old guy. I still like to read books. But are you going to have access to even digital library? That still requires hours of reading. So you can understand the history of your country, the history of the world, the history of human civilization going back millions of years. These are all fundamental to our existence. But if we don't have the economic necessities of life providing, how do you do it? How does a child read at night unless they have electricity in their room, a quiet room separate from their parents, where they can turn on the light at any time and read a book? That doesn't exist in a lot of places. Wealthy people have it, but majority of people don't have it. So the question in the United States and the question of Africa is actually very similar. If we don't develop an educated citizenry, we may walk into another dark age or other catastrophes, because there's nothing that we're doing now today that is putting us on the right course. Now, if you look, for example, at some of the Asian countries, and you look at China, they're very much focused on science. And that's why some of the best students in the United States are from Asia. They're much more serious about it. To get into a state university, which most Chinese cannot afford unless they get a scholarship, you have to have good grades. And this is sine qua non in Chinese families. So the fact of the matter is, human beings were created to advance the physical universe itself. That's why we were brought into existence somewhere in the last 3 to 7 million years. And we have to fulfill that purpose. We're not an animal scrouching around with our snout, digging a hole in the ground to find some food. We're the most noble species that's ever existed, and we have to live up to that nobility. And that's not possible without education. And I would emphasize science, because in science, you're studying the physical laws of the universe. And they're either right or they're wrong. There's no opinion involved here. And that would also put a more disciplined notion for our school systems in terms of education. But you can't do that if you can't read. And you can't read if you get to the third grade and only 1/3 of the students have the basics of reading. For me, reading, I can't imagine my existence without reading. And I was not a great student. It's just something I understood myself and promoted myself. And it's made my life worthwhile living.
I couldn't agree more. What in terms of economics, one thing that I will share is my little memory when I was still in the Philippines doing all this nursing, right? And as a holistic nurse. So when someone is diagnosed with tuberculosis, I will always see that if they're coming from a poor family, if they're poor, that tuberculosis will never get better. The condition will not. But if the person who would diagnose with the same tuberculosis has the money, has the family support, the person gets better. And that's why I've always connected health to politics, to economics, and other things. Then I came to America. I went to visit as a tourist in Virginia, so past your state. I said, wow, I'm very impressed that they were able to keep all the, sort of like part of the history, like let's say where they put the pig's food in a wooden thing. I forgot the name, but they put a pig's food and a dirt soil. So I kept thinking, this in America. But then I come from the Philippines, and that's not history. That's still going on in my country. Dirt, soil, pig's food. So it's like, wow, it's really interesting how different countries differ. So that's why recently, I don't know if any of you had, had a pleasure of listening to Putin's full live stream with young scientists.
No,
And it was so good. I was very impressed and very envious at the same time, because he was listening to all these young scientists, and it was, of course, mainly from from Russia, but all different institutions, and he was listening to them. And yes, they were all talking about science, math, everything, and he was asking them, so what can we do? What do you need? Da, da, da. And it was, and then one of the professors, he asked the professor, so how many students do you have? How many teachers? So he said 1,000 students, 200 something students, and how much do you get as the head? And she said a number. And by the way, this live stream was simultaneously being translated, and that's technology. And that, again, on the side note, is impressive, because if we understand other cultures, then maybe we will stop listening to just the hegemony of the global West of what we don't understand and see. So the lady said this much, and he said, that's not really bad. That's a good salary. Then she said, well, it's not about the salary. Putin said, it is about the salary, because if you pay your positions well, then young people will go to those courses. So, it in a way, it's good that, that is an incentive. So then recently, he also had that he was talking to the Russia calling some kind of summit also. And oh yeah, there was a German who questioned, and he was emphasizing sovereignty. That he even asked the German who questioned him, "Why are you talking in English? Why can't you speak to me in German?" So that is sovereignty. He said that's the basis of all this coming together, or if you want Germany, if your company. So it was very. So I really appreciate all of your time, and what you do for us, and from with other people, and of course PD and all of it. But it's quite lovely to be able to share this. So if there's anything more that you want to say, and please, you're always welcome to join us in whatever way or form. So please.
Well, let me just address the issue of culture as a closing statement. we each culture may have different philosophers who they follow, but these philosophers are going to find ways that, without knowing or not knowing others, they have developed the same conception of humankind. So, for example, if you look at Confucius, I believe he was born about 50 years, I think, before Socrates. So they're not contemporary, but they're very close. And if you look at China, you see Confucius' conceptions, which have an understanding of the nobility of man and of love and of development. And of course, Socrates, for me, is one of my heroes that helped shape my life, was reading his dialogues, because he constantly is demanding of the youth to draw out of them their thoughts. He called himself a midwife of ideas, that he didn't create life, but he pulled life out of his students. And it was always in the Socratic method, in which he would ask the questions which were almost impossible to answer. But by trying to answer them, his students would actually learn. And he said, well, what I know is that how much I don't know. So it was constantly striving. So when I was in Greece in July, I think of this past year, June, July, and of course, I'd studied Greek history for years. So for me, it was a great opportunity to see all my heroes. But on my last day there, I went to the Agora, which was the original market that established the nation of Athens. And in that market, they still have the relics there, and you could see where St. Paul preached around 100 AD, and the road he walked down on to get there. And you could see where, Socrates preached. They had his area there. And it was just, for me, it was sheer enjoyment. But then they added something to the Agora, which obviously wasn't there 2,500 years ago, which is, and it was recent, the last few years, they put there a statue of Socrates and opposite Confucius. So, of course, I had my wife take my picture between them. But the fact is that, to me, whoever did that, the Athenian government or the Greek government, I don't know, but that's a real positive way of developing a common notion of mankind. Have these two philosophers next to each other, and arguably the most famous real estate in the world is the Agora, not because it has monetary value. This is the history of Western civilization came from there. And then they have the founder of Chinese Oriental philosophy and culture next to each other. And that's what we have to recognize, is that every culture, if it's a human culture, and every government, if it's a legitimate government, is going to have the same self-interest in development of the minds of its people. And from that standpoint, I see economics. And then finances is just low on the list. It's just a mechanism we set up subjectively. We create currencies. We create these banks. We create the rules. And all that is a creation of something that will facilitate something higher, which is the economy, which is essential for the development of the human mind. So for me, these are all tied in together, and I don't see them as separate separate concepts. They're all united together in this one fundamental principle, which I think governs the entire physical universe up to this point and will in the future.
Well, thanks a lot, Lawrence. And someday I'll meet you in person. I think we're in the same time zone.
Yep.
So, and this is your website. It's Lawrence Freeman, Africa and the World.com. And so feel free. And you just type in his name in search, and then you'll find other interviews. Right, Lawrence?
Correct. Shukran Gazarian.
And thank you to everyone. And like PDs, also find her in Africa at gender.net. And Drago, as usual, in the infobricks.org. And Roy at the Awakening podcast. And Hartmut in his Go Your Own Path. And yours truly, find me in gracesagra.com. Okay. And take care, everyone. So as we wrap this, thank you again. And please, we thank all our audience and followers, and share, like, subscribe, and donate to any of the concerns of our guests, and be well. And yeah, let's keep on doing what we're doing in the most positive way and educate ourselves continuously. Take care.
If we do the good, something good is going to happen.
Exactly.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
So I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. As mentioned at the start, you can find my 6 podcasts on roycollin.com or scan the QR code if you're looking to start a podcast or do a podcasting tour, help with that. Also, if you're looking for a virtual assistant, we also have that service. And you can help the show by visiting the store, supporting our sponsors, or making a donation. Until next week, take care.